just said to me, I think Writer's House is slipping from Writer's House time to poetry time. And it's poet's time. It's 6:07. We don't do that. We start at 6 if we say 6. So I'm asking everybody, Orchid, save that seat for me, please. Inviting everybody to find a place. And before I give Jack the mic, I just wanted to say, we have a couple seats in there. I just wanted to say apologies. And the green couch is a fantastic, Devani's he's already got it. The green couch is a fantastic spot. The Arts Cafe is under renovation, as you can see. It's going to be open in mid-October. It's going to be fabulous, but it's not ready yet. And we apologize because the rain drove us inside, but then the rain stopped, and so we're here. And it's a little cooler in there than in here. We make do. And we are, after the proceedings, we have a great spread, which would be kind of the magic, because that room turns into the reception room. Not sure exactly how we'll do it, but I'm glad everybody's here. Anyway, I'm going to give it to Jack, so thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you, Al. Just a couple of announcements. Is Steve Dolph here? No? Yeah. Junior Wells. All right. There we go. That's going to change for Orchid. Probably will change for you too, Ron. Okay, so I have a list up here that all the readers should just announce the next person. I don't think that Steve Dolph is going to be here, and also Chris McCreary couldn't make it because their roof is leaking, which is a bummer on several different levels. Yeah, really. Home ownership is not all it's cracked up to be, as probably many of you know. Anyway, let's move on here. I am really, really happy that you all came out to hear us read from this collection of work here, and I consider it a real honor and a blessing, really, to have been able to keep this work in circulation. It's amazing on so many different levels. It's alternately hilarious and deeply philosophical. And I never knew David, but I really wish that I had. So anyway, having said all that, I'm going to read a short piece from a longer poem called The Harbor Master of Hong Kong. I thought there was a harbor master of Hong Kong because during my student days, I used to hang out with a couple, and the wife had an ex-boyfriend who would visit her once a month when he was on a post-payday bender. He would spend the night drinking and making long-distance phone calls. I was present once when he put me onto an intern at Guy's Hospital. This chap had been interrupted at his tea time while dawn was breaking in Vancouver. Don't be impatient. This is a narrative of capitalism. I had nothing to say to the good doctor, and likewise at his end, but we were polite and amused with one another. Another story about this phone call maker, which was strictly hearsay to me, had him going through much trouble to reach the harbor master at Hong Kong. And when he did, he bugled, "Clear those junks out of the way, we're coming through." This is a narrative of imperialism, too. And next is Charles Bernstein.
So that was Jack Krick. Jack lives here in Philadelphia, and he works with me on the Electronic Poetry Center, and edited with Ron Silliman and Bob Perelman, who comes back to Penn for the first time in a while. This wonderful book, so I wanted to thank the three of them for putting this together. You know, we say labor of love, but the emphasis could also be on labor. So this is an enormous amount of work. I also would commend the Penn Sound page we got from David and Cecilia, his wife, an enormous amount of David's readings, and it's really worthwhile hearing him read. And then tomorrow we continue, with some of us anyway, in New York at St. Mark's, where we'll do a version of this. And also want to give a special welcome here to the Blank Seminar, my final graduate seminar, all together in the premium seats. I'm hoping that, you know, my idea with Al, I've always said this, but I don't know that he's for it, is that they should put in a glass box back where you are, and have like a bar and, charge like $500 for those seats through the season. But I guess Al is not going for that. But they are renovating, so. So David was such an incredible presence in my life, and so supportive, and so generous, and difficult too. He often would take things the wrong way, and that was an interesting thing to talk him out of seeing something that he saw so clearly was against him that was not. But it had to do with his work, which always had an angle to life and to everyday matters. And what we mostly talked about was the 7 types of irony, comedy, or ambiguity, which for us went into the hundreds. And we talked a long time about the significance of the comic and the ironic, which we both shared and spurred ourselves ever onward with. So it's great to have all of his work. And there's so many wonderful long pieces in this book. It would be great to hear them all. We're just going to hear slight tidbits tonight. So what I'm going to read is a pastiche of quotes from David, and it comes from several works of his that are in the book: The Uneven Steps of Hang Chow, Tight Corners, Threads, and My Poetry. Bromige's poetry is a guide for the love-lorn and love-drenched, a devilish excursion into a psychorealism for which laughter is the exact analog to human breath and paranoia, an anecdote for keeping your mind in view. If wants to be the same as is, the bottom of everyday life drops through, as landmines are triggered by the reader's darting glances. This book is a blow struck for meaning, and boy, do these poems blow. David Bromige's hour has come, and it begins here. So that's my blurb for the book. And this is all from the pieces I mentioned. It was written for a special issue of the Difficulties magazine, Tom Beckett's magazine, available on Eclipse online, as we discussed in the Blank seminar. You can see this issue. And it's was, as I say, 1990, and quotes mostly from David. Cognition requires exaggeration, writes David Bromige in Indictable Suborners. And the converse would apply equally to explain his method. Exaggeration requires cognition. In extremis luminatus ludicrous. However, it is an ungracious task, as the oxymoron says, to try to explain a joke. You get it, or better yet, A, it gets you, B, you don't get it. That is, in these works, it's not, quote, subject matter, shop-worn hangnail, but form, allopathic progenitor that's made intrinsically funny. Quote, it is easier to see through my little tales than it is to see through the pernicious society we are trapped within. But the difference is merely scale. And it may begin to account for why each poem is approached and so apprehended in a determinately different way. When you start to doubt your own skepticism, look out, Bromige says. Bromige has never fixed on any one style or mode. There are characteristic reverberations, of course, but tackles, targets, new turf, segmentation sections with each tussle, 6 of one, couple of half dozen of other. Quote, it was very dark inside the fish. This is among the most poignant thoughts I know. This is a good deal different and more humanely refreshing in the sense that a breath is more refreshing than a cough, than the idea of form as plastique. For Bromige, the question becomes, what color plastic, and why not rubber? As to subsequent matters, Bromige makes mincemeat of the fashions of the contemporary mind. Quote, The era had a milky density, tepid and torpid, mildly disgusting, like a one-acre home site. This disgust had spoken of the rebuttal to its final vestige of candid spontaneity, except that the toothache of the times looped a scarf over everybody's ears, unquote, and builds from there. An Englishman who came to the US of A by way of British Columbia, AKA Canada's gray sunbelt, he has made cultural distance into a prosodic measure that leans on device without being divisive. Quote, there is an intense pleasure of experience in juxtaposing of the two polysyllabic words with the staccato monosyllables. Greift and spook, particularly spook me, unquote. In this passage from Threads, Bromige is referring to a quote from Heidegger. For the present context, hot tub retotalization would do as well, as there'll be a hot tub at the totalization tonight, requiring a further introjection into our unconscious episiotomies. Doesn't all innovation in knowing happen much as a pun? The thread of likeness enables one to articulate what is, in one sense, the utterly dissimilar, since new, or what had been forgotten. Eternity and paternity become avenues of access. The reader is left to draw the moral after Bromige has provided the tone and tonic. Quote, and still we hold there are times when we can bear witness to the present condition and still we hold that there are times, and still we hold that there are times when we can bear witness to the present condition of absolute things. For language can take us there, wherever it is. The next reader, Rachel Blau DuPlessis. Pleasure to have Rachel back here at the Writers' House.
And maternity. Not just paternity and eternity or whatever. He's very eloquent. He is completely prolific and very self-different, as has been already said. I didn't know him, so I can't comment further, but everyone has been most eloquent about his work. He's so self-different that it's hard to get a handle on him, and that is part of why we're here, getting various handles, however we stand on Bromige. He's actually quite an intellectual. He's a master of allusion, as you just said about Heidegger. But anyway, I don't want to go on. Shrinking things making us feel bigger is from Red Hats. The cosmos, psychiatry, something with sex written all under it, etc., etc. Every day like Christmas, everything getting small enough to be born again. Comedian topples, finally, down manhole. Audience swells with amusement, bursts in two. Applause. Two tiny tabs, and he exclaims at being everywhere almost at once. Being everywhere. Fermi's backfire, a solitary person standing for all of us. Between two double lines of cars standing for all of us also. That was poetry. This is prose. Time is attractive in a period of rapidly increasing wealth. We can hardly wait. You have to hear what we paid for this place and just guess what it's worth today. To impress the crowd's meanness upon himself, he envisaged the day when even the outcasts would be ready to advocate a well-ordered life, condemn libertinism, and reject everything except money. Easy for him to say. This first edition of Baudelaire set us back a pretty penny. Why was an entire generation raised to despise money? And why did we have to be part of it? Its acquisition was supposed to breed callousness, but that was just our parents' opinion, and they're all dead now. But when money becomes the universal unconscious equals ideology, we become, as always, when what's unconscious is in control, inefficient as a species, firing whistleblowers to perpetuate error nobody much cares about before the banks begin to fail. Then all hell breaks loose. This is actually a history of the present. The cliches smash through the backdrop, clanking. 1 minute, ordinary people were reading Sayonara in the Benjo. The next, the way of Zen had led its logophage to call the cops out. Klinnemann's queer for exogamy, but right then a concluding ensemble, which serves as an epilogue, is frequently omitted. The oppressive, as Charles would say, the oppressive misuse of the term unique. And let's include all valorization of the individual with its particular voice, perpetuation of anachronistic hierarchies, cultivation of foible, stems from a prior suspicion, too feared to be acknowledged, that by the terms of our society, namely monetary worth, all are, however inequitably disposed along its curve, interchangeable units, defined as capable of causing amounts of currency to adhere to themselves. This is where it's really the present. Sexual activity has become one of the chief masking routines, ideologically calculated to buy off any such awareness. Concurrently, an alternative system continues to operate, threatening, even as it is threatened, by the first one spoken of here, whose units measure by their abilities by a different sets of criteria. But any one of us belongs to both systems. Is the pronoun I a healing declaration of self, or the last refuge of a scoundrel? This is the last concluding paragraph I ever intend to write. That last line was, of course, why I chose the passage. Ryan Eckes, my former student, with pleasure.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me like this? How's that?
Let's go for best.
Let's go for best.
Be best. A little bit further out. There you go.
Love it up.
This is a prose piece called My Career. I can't abide people who start to talk as soon as they enter a room without pausing to check out what's going on in there. That's what I think about growing up late in a slow time. As for sleeping dogs, shout and turn purple. My first words were fort and da. So they put a box turtle in my crib, which I took apart to see why it didn't tick. Fixed tunings and scales were invented, and the charm of single notes. A veil of melancholy slipped over my eyes, and it was strange. This kid was putting stresses on syllables that were seldom under stress before. He got little more than a polite hand or fingering, for words are not only the keys of persuasion, but so full of holes a bus could drive right through. Simply ask for a transfer. You gonna ride a boxcar? It was very dark inside the fish. Trying to think without jumping. Little more than a fingerling at the fascinating question, how did music begin? Kissing Joyce King in the fishmonger's doorway on Cricklewood Broadway. The world allows no hermits. There are two tragedies in life. The little yes, gone on a breath, I forget the rest. Time went haywire. There were always people in the time. Nothing taught sex was important. I could see well if that's what a magnet is. You liked my body? Yes, was that what it was? And she was right. I represented a system, so it was broken up. This is history. One blots out another. My voice ran on easily and garrulously, carefully dressing panic. You won't see me in silk suits and Cadillacs, but I could never divorce them, and under the saint's robe one always senses the presence of the goat foot. Bah, ma, books, you get right out of this doorway. To himself he was a man with a mission still unfulfilled. Is Patience talking? Is Patience talking? God, do I hear her voice? Competition is the keynote, sometimes winningly justified as cutthroat. Were all these rejections qualified? Had he indeed been a mere hunk of matter? Was his first wife really a tramp? He paused to scratch and thus upset the assembly plant. He selects with care that which is appropriate. He rejects the superfluous. Too much discontinuity threatens the identity of the person. Just such as I am done with, hopefully. Wholly opposed to the use of examples which Plato introduced and philosophy repeated in its poetries ever since, as matters of indifference in themselves. The carrier of these projections may even become a special enemy, perhaps a bête noire. That's my last Duchess, Browning on the spit. What is too silly to be said is sung. Lully died somewhat prematurely as a result of poor medical attention to a wound incurred by, of all things, striking his toe with a stick used to beat time. I lived on adrenaline. I surveyed the panic of rich women. What bliss when the iris came into being. What bliss when the iris came into being. In 1968, I was 34 and, with something over 40 years of productive writing ahead, and my greatest yet to do, the life to follow had been marked out. Gathering the ends and threads 10 years in the making, from the words of the best, the spells and blessings uttered in tight corners out of my hands. If the artist is to endure, a change from the fevered pattern finally emerges. Jay calls this new method a sculpted creativity. I learned to read all over. I was never into that thing about building a saleable character. Either they like me or they need more time. Each person's work seems to depend on and be connected with his neighbors, and the whole posse appeared. But though he could make all these things, it is mentioned as a remarkable fact that with all his ingenuity, and after many efforts, for he made many, he never could make a wicker basket. These wearisome, sickening little personal novels. Solemnity is a sign of fraud. Let's do something big for America. The crux is what happens in it, not a thesis or position. The texture, not the deductive or inductive curse of one-track minds. The door stood open. The long sloping fall of haunches from the socket of the back sobbed bitterly. The long sloping fall of haunches from the socket of the back sobbed bitterly. Logic might be unanswerable because it is so absolutely wrong. We're all plucked apples, so let's make cider of a large question. The ant went up the plan. George Economou.
You all hear me all right? Okay. My voice not what it used to be, but in the late 60s or early 70s, I encountered the one day to be accomplished poet Bernadette Mayer in a sibylline squat in front of the entrance to St. Mark's Church. She greeted me with a challenge. Have you reckoned with the language poets yet? My reply that I had not, meaning as a school, but not excluding particular poets, inspired her to abruptly terminate the conversation by flinging at me the most gross imperative in our language. Now, I have always insisted on giving much more credit to poets than to schools of poetry, and dare you to privilege the significance of such so-called associations above their individual accomplishments. Just remember that most famous and shakiest of schools, the metaphysical poets, so confidently formulated by Samuel Johnson a full century after the deaths of John Donne, Ben Jonson, et al. So no, for me, Ron Silliman, Bob Perelman, David Bromige are first and foremost singular poets rather than constituents of a school. Indeed, what I get above all from this magnificent volume that Jack Krick, Ron, and Bob have so astutely and lovingly created is a powerful sense of the amity and affinity among the fellowship of poets. And make no mistake about it, it is a piece of the same quality of amity and affinity that lights up this very space we come together in year after year. So here we are, fortunate in our fellowship as we assemble this evening, so lucky to bask in the poetry of David Bromige, and lucky for me to read and for you to hear this splendid poem that I searched and searched for, and finally settled on as an essential statement of what David Bromige is all about. Night with Eye for the Star, on page 447. And note the inspired, brilliant personal appropriation of Immanuel Kant's great categorical imperative at the top and the final stunning word of the poem. Night for eye with the star resolves into horizontal bands, the sedate walk of the categorical imperative. Our servants cover the remainder. One pulls on a rope that activates the bell, that tugs at our ears and draws out our lives. The inexplicable and the unexplained. Some things are too important. Starry night of the classics, the verb formed from constellation, so that once upon a rhyme. Mercy had anticipated sin, one dwelling much as another. They wear the same outfits. Resentment treads heavily, and our ceiling is its floor, of the supernumerous welling, faking its accidents. Their beauty, that of flowers, not fruit, consumed by our founder. Odd turns we take, so many glottal stops, so many grotty loops, how Hamlet-like a lens, that all the old stories draw a circle and draw a circle. They were wasted in the square, the composition of the little panes. What price fame? The grave awaits. The ways of lighting, the same, having no idea where it may lead, God going beyond in his ways. I feel my Father looking down on me. These chairs were made in our image, in the image of those we obey. So many years of victory resulting in defeat. The page turns indecipherable. All we can take is what we've given away. We can't speak of the display, except what it reminds one of the masking love washed over by these waves of the indifferent. Beauty, 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 a single swatch of green, identically that looks on intensity and never sees. Salt instancing contagion indicates this life among the new illiterate matters, to whom insist the self. The next reader is Eli Goldblatt.
This is a great ride and a wonderful book. Thank you very much for bringing this to light. I'm just going to read a couple poems from Spells and Blessings, and I chose this because I never met David Bromige, but I once lived about 25 miles away from him when I was working in a vineyard in Sonoma, and I was too oblivious to know that he was there. Spells and Blessings. This is a poem called Dictation. At last the gods have left me free to do wherever I am moved. Am I forbidden? Then remember to forget, if also only by old patterns grave others wove in me. Abandoned where I am right, he is wrong to me, but in his own right. As day to me Pacific over London lies night, and rightly so. What though I take it lightly? Free to believe whatever I am. I have that right, I've heard. Title. Now we have a car we have to drive to Bolinas, whose beaches are known to us to be images of destination. Last night I was in London, in this house seemingly, where my father was, and spoke with him. If he failed to listen, there is nothing one can do about it. Today I read an ad for a charter trip and was sad because I didn't have $277. For the airlines, by such possibilities, create distance to sell it to us, yet accomplices will sell us the currency through a little grating in the plasticine. And this one, and I don't know if this refers to Olson's refusal to do the tarot after he predicted his mother's death, but this is a little poem called The Tarot. The tarot neither is nor isn't key to this world's code. The cards exist, and apprehension uses all its entities to let its tale be told. Thank you very much. Oh, and the next reader is David Hancock.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Congratulations to Jack and Ron and Bob for producing such an amazing volume. I'm going to read a poem called Able to Describe the Verses. It's in Desire, the collection Desire, and also in my poetry. According to Cecilia Bromige, it was written by doing fake translations from Neruda. I'm not really completely sure what she meant by fake, but anyway, able to describe the verses. Able to describe the verses, more sad each night. In the night, like the two of them between my arms, they kissed like tarantulas beneath an infinite sky. She quizzed me, I quizzed her back, as if I had a friend with big fizzy eyes. Able to, exactly as I said before, thinking that I can't go on, feeling lost. Ear to immensity's night, immense with her. On the other hand, my soul turns rocks into paste. What does it matter? My love can't guard its shame. The night is starry and she isn't with me still. So much for death, for song with its laws, for laws. My soul is not contented with having lost her someplace. As if she were here, I admire her hairsuit, my heart her hairsuit, and she isn't in it. The mismatched night blanks out the mismatched trees. Our sisters, those who entice, the same backwards as forwards. I don't know why, that's certain. Perhaps I should ask her. My voice grows furry as it blows about her idea. The other. Be the other. Come kiss me like before. Her voice, her clear form, her infinite pupils. Why, I don't know for sure. Maybe we'll discuss some ways. The short 10 of love, the large 10 of oblivion. Why is night like the two of them between my arms, my discontented soul with the beauty it has lost? Although the sea is the ultimate sadness she can cause me, and as I told Sean, this is the ultimate paper boat I shall make her. Tom Mandel is the next reader.
I can't resist telling you how I met David. It was, I think, early in 1975 at the home of, what was Peter's last name? Peter Holland and Jean Lance, and a dinner party, which was, I think, set up so that in order for me to meet him. And I also met Barry Watton that night. Jean did the cooking, I believe, and she made oysters Rockefeller. I was seated right next to David. He was at the end of the one table, and I was next to him along the length of it. And his first oyster had a pearl in it. I kid you not. And then, to my shock, so did his second oyster. And to paraphrase Ron, I really felt that this was a person I should get to know. And in fact, he lived around the corner from me for a while in the Haight, and I had an office in the for a while in the China Basin building, if any of you know San Francisco. And Cecilia worked in the neighborhood, and although I didn't drive her to work because she went to work on time, I actually drove her home. And this is during the early days of their relationship. I drove her home every day for about 6 months, so that I got a completely other angle on from her on David, which I don't remember, thank goodness, and I won't therefore go into. The older you are in this room, the more likely it is that I know you.
This means you, Carl.
Yeah. I know you, for example, extremely well. No. I wanted to read Bipolar Disorder in Autumn because David was a master of opposites, and you might have taken him for an ironist, if you hung out with him. But in fact, he was behind the ironist was this guy who was making fun of irony. So, and Bipolar Disorder in Autumn, and I hope I can do this. No. I tried to create one. At a time like this, odd to dispute fruitfulness, I defy anyone to hear the word fruitfulness, face creased by much assiduous study of the sun, without expanding, although the word sun I find strikingly dull next to Helios or bless, and of its opposite, the self I bless. But let me confess right now, since I began to run in order to release, to make a final run backwards round the sprockets with these invert trees, a fever, the universe has lost its charms. Trees waving their welcome intentions upon the core of each elegant theory stashed in their shells. Mere fuzzy things. Their crop all run to core. People also seem emptied, unattractive shells, as they suddenly are, less like winkles and more, while I myself, who usually crave more, like the Opera House in Sydney, while I myself, who usually crave more, like the Opera House in Sydney, expensive bees, who like nothing better than to hear about bees dancing to tell where the honey is, who only seek to cease in furs, thrilling much to their alarm at the ceaseless clamor come to pry them from their cells, destroy the hamlet to save it from its cells. First, things start costing too much at the corner store. I don't care whether death is a figure from an old junk store with appropriate accoutrement coming to find overcrowding, invasion of personal space. We find one more dramatic and important person for the threshing floor, strangers asleep on the table, no food on the floor, or simply a stage in a natural process like the wind. It's cold, colder, then too hot, no wind. It becomes increasingly difficult to decide if you're asleep, if the only means for me to obtain a good night's sleep, drowsed with the fumes of poppies. While the hook is to die, then let me die. Life's baited hook through the belly of the unlucky lover of flowers. To me, today's a naked question mark. It's slight flowers, wax beneath glass. No more worry how to keep in the chamber of horrors. Easily keep you from losing yourself in a brook. The distillation of experience, rippling like a brook or ornamental pool it runs into. Look into book upon book and get others to look. You've been ripening for years, days, hours. It neither coheres nor incoheres. Given minutes make up hours. I was full of life, of fun, of passion, and thought they would be better for my being here. And to you, love of my life, desired me to make of time a day. Now I'm sorry, but this darkness is the single hue, comes the collapse. Ask this of the sick. They testify. Once the body is too liberated by its viruses to bother what day, it's facing into a mirror of dubious hue. I'll be better off dead. If you have to, mourn, or the swallows and nightingales and Venus aloft. Yet it's doubtful that any find the energy to mourn the disappearance of a ladder said to lead aloft to where the person, albeit altered, never dies. How luminous off Maui the sensuous memory dies, and only words remain, cord, shell, to shuck. Why born? It's turned into a fence, since burnt, that bourne from which no traveler writes home, a soft subsection of the cerebellum. That's it for me, some soft bed, heroin, or morphine. Let me be your friend, like the word croft. Fade from this present to be hid in your everyday skies. Let roaches persist. Oh, yes, in their croft. Tomorrow's vegetables are wise to praise fair skies. And one more really short one, which I'm reading mostly because I was afraid no one else would read it, and it's really great. The last poem in the book, Squeaking Wheels. I thought someone was parking my car in front of my house. Then I thought that someone was my wife, and that it was our house. We were or happily married, and had a child whom we loved. Friends came to visit. We had careers and goals, ideas about the world, and brilliant memories. Then I was waking up, escaping from my dreams, which I once enjoyed, and now feel as traps. They are not filled with meaning. I am not. Thank you. Jason Mitchell. Jason Mitchell is next.
Thank you. And hey, Jack. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to read two poems on the shorter side that are particularly beautiful to me at this moment in my life. I dreamt that I dreamt some land where no one spoke my language. So it took more than I can tell to get across. And in that land, I was immortal. And there it was, we met. You put your hand on mine, and I could speak and sense you comprehend, and start to feel I knew what you were saying, that we should stay together until I'd learned to follow you completely. And that I did, I thought, until one day you led me where I knew we'd hit upon that place set aside for us to live together and forever, where we would work safe from interruption to perfect this miracle. I woke beside someone like you, speaking a kind of English, laughing. And the second poem that I chose is from Variable Bundles. Song of the Sun. Achilles had that heel because you have to stand someplace or have to start somewhere. The purest idealist was thrust headlong amongst us. My mother was beautiful. She was lovely beyond compare. Held to her breasts and belly, held by her meaty arms inside her dark flowing hair. The speaker was drugged by design. She put me away where 3 women a day taught me how to be kind and cruel, who all dressed the same, remembered my name, but which of them played with my tool? From these who taught difference, she borrowed me back for as long as she could, offered herself as topic sentence in the chapter called My Life. Speaker reads the footnotes, glancing away from her text. Been out so long seems like it's into me. Do you do language writing only on Tuesdays and Thursdays? Isn't that sufficient praxis and never by design? This utterer too lax is? There's no falling for his line. We've met his sort in taxis and thrown up on his wine. He's got a place on Naxos, atop a narrow chine. Thank you.
Jason. Who are we hearing?
Where's your list? Yeah, I don't need the list to know who I am. Frank Sherlock. Waiting for anyone but Godot. The flower that opens and fills the room with scent, the eye with color, how blessed to us seem such lives. Does one choose? By this, he meant to question a life spent fetching up stuff from the basement. Philosophy is less important than humanity, who hope against hope, and these words can actually be said. Am I waiting because I know the word, or a word because waiting is my referent? No moment need be dull or indifferent, for the compulsive conviction is never our own. Judas betrays interesting parallels. He asked his father, did he think living life on the brink in unremitting intensity meant one attained to truth? His father, picking his phrases carefully, replied, no, not in any sense that would privilege intensity, simply that one might thus learn the truth of such living. Each character meticulously unpacks a wallop. Writing cannot frankly write without the estrangement of a square and empty room. To plot a climax is a disappointment in advance. To be disputes the premise, to remain its living disputant. We find we are frightened when applied to the most profound shortfalls. The ordeal being not much deeper than a puddle we judge by its content, not its shape, and yet unassignable to whatever might make you think chill from the wind of doom. That slow magic trick that leaves the glass half empty, half full. Honor driven by romantic dream, heroes to themselves rank forms. Paradox can be a device for generating details in their articles. The fact that nobody departs and says he does must prove our haunted genius. Kept Pence best entertainment to forget all that's already happened. Absorbing cavalcade of humanity on the rack. Parade your drill. The Bible knows it all and knows it all, and even knows how you might feel concerning that predicated trap. An electronic gnocchi maker. All over, people struggle towards dignity while the pictures precede the blue pencil or the shears, seeing more things. Don't you often or ever wonder where we are being taken, yet surely it's more where are we going? The economist can tell us as surely as the priest he has replaced. Teleology shapes dialogue. Often I can't decide quite what it is being said. Life is a nightmare, metaphorically speaking, at those times when one has lost control to larger figures of significance. Yet irritation plus depression want to announce the coming of calamity. Antecedents stimulate his transcending imitation. Astigmatic eyes register abnormal persons in abnormal circumstance, baffling comparisons with dramatic asides. A history exists to tell us why we needed to replace the infantile sotto voce lament. He desires to deserve the attention he is getting. Everyone was acting like so many Freudian rats as supreme effort clinched its right to be one of the great triumphs of the individual. It is encouraging to be able to see the forbidden, and sometimes keenly traumatic, inducing a blind spot where his mother dipping him from the river. This convincing thesis does much to explain pointless endings in terms of failure to find peace by natural conscience or scientific reason when God and rejection coincide. An admirer of faith in life will invariably attempt the dismissal of dismal disillusion. The diction of inconsistent realism reaches the obvious conclusion that there are no mistakes. The man he had argued with is long since dead because he hanged himself. Orchid Tierney.
Thanks. Let me bring this a lot closer. Thanks, Jack, Bob, and Ron as well for this really fabulous collection of essential poems. I'm going to read two shorter poems. One of which is called, it has a visual title, and it's called Art as Revenge, but the G in revenge has a stroke through it, so you can read it as Art as Revenge, Art as Revenue. Hear me, you hear, your utterance is authentic as anything turned into print. Cherished cat of the Occident, I who sprayed the sacred shrines am shit scared in the present by people working for a living. Thus I flatten you into a piece of currency prized among tastemakers who select only for the likes of wee and you, definitely not the shadow of a G stretching out from your feet, pause, swearing he's beneath us. The second poem I'm going to read is on page 482. From Vulnerable Bundles. It's number 10, called Rhetoric. When you look at these poems, you realize that the scoring with punctuation is very sparse, but I think that the poems regulate themselves at the level of the syllable. I decided to tell you why it isn't possible to interrupt the form of the present with another form of recent past, despite the lonely feeling of oblivion impending and the sad flirtation with despair at the waste we witness. The poets in their skill we've long been breathing. Meanwhile, a few jokes win the prizes. Money likes a sure thing. But if it is too late indeed, then weren't the cosmos and the bougainvillea just what we're after? I had decided to ask when the system failed. Beggars on the street keep our shame honest. So to the linear that had happened. That is happening. You will respond. This is not the form of the present. You will be right, and only right, again. Ron Silliman.
In 1968, I was a creative writing student at San Francisco State, and a good friend of mine there who had been a student as an undergraduate of Robert Kelly's knew that I had been corresponding with Robert and was interested in that poetics. So he convinced me to go across the bay to the Albany Public Library to hear this poet by the name of Harvey Bialy. And he didn't know the other fellow who was reading with Bialy. Oddly enough, it was the very same room at the Albany Public Library where 6 years before I had discovered the desert music and thus had discovered poetry. So I was more than a little intrigued at that rhyme. It was a series run by a man by the name of Paul Mariah, which was not actually his given name, but was the name he took after being released from prison for being involved in a gay relationship in Utah. And oh, this is such a great David moment. David would have such a good comment about this, Tom. Anyway, the other reader that night, reading from his first U.S. book, I believe, Gathering, was David Bromige. And, Harvey was fine, but, he was fine in an okay way. Whereas David took the top of my head off, as Emily Dickinson would say. And on page 26 of the hymnal is the poem that came at me like a drug. And if you listen to it, it's all in the vowels. It's called First, from the ends of the earth. One aches to know, one fact is axiom to act. Whatever I do, I die as you also at times doubt the beneficence of the inevitable, terror, earthbound as one is. Despair, however one does, the word depends upon another, is désespoir, mere lack of hope, and dies with my belief. So hope is first, no spoken first, against what I have to call the silence, though a kind of humming intervenes, of an instance as this evening, lying on a bed I lack, energy to make, to look into the black, gathers at the ceiling, from a lamp I lack the energy to break. By the end of that poem, I knew I had to know this poet. And he and I got to be very good friends for a very long time, in part because neither of us at that point drove, which meant we were forever figuring out how to get rides together to go to places. And that was a useful form of getting together in those terms. When I was asked to edit this book, and it occurred in a rather unusual fashion, in that David's 75th and last birthday party in Sebastopol, which I was not at, Kathleen Fraser announced that he was going to have a big book of poems and that I was going to be the editor. About a week later, it occurred to her to ask me, but in that particular sequence. And as I have done in the past under similar circumstances, such as when Robert Duncan and Richard Baker Roshi told me that I was the person to run a reading series at the Sahara Bakery, I gave essentially the same answer I did then, which was, well, if I can talk Bob Perelman into helping me. And so we got started on the project and then found ourselves getting bogged down, and Jack Krick volunteered to rescue us and has done a fabulous job and is still doing a fabulous job as the shepherd of this book. So I want to say thanks to all of them. Anyway, after David had passed away, I found myself in his basement in Sebastopol going through boxes of letters, postcards, and I came across a manuscript I did not recognize. And I thought, well, you know, David used so many different small presses, it makes sense that there's one or two that have gotten away from me, but this was one that hadn't. It just had never appeared in public. Only the first poem from it had appeared in print in that issue of The Difficulties. You heard part of it in Frank Sherlock's reading, and I'm going to read a couple of short curses from it. This is from American Testament, and as best we can tell, since David never wrote an answer to this question to anybody that I'm aware of, he had an unwritten rule that every one of his books had to be completely different, and that he really had to essentially become a different poet by the time each book came out. You have to think about what an amazing commitment that is, not the least of which is that you're perpetually abandoning your publishers. In any case, he felt this may have been too close to my poetry, which I would argue is the best book any language poet ever wrote. But he felt, I think, that it was too much still language poetry, so he moved on from that, which is a shame because American Testament is itself a great book. So here's a couple of curses, and they do point out the ways in which David is a satirist, and they're portraits of living poets, some of you will recognize them. And if you do, you're sworn to secrecy. So, a couple of curses. 1, demanding for himself the right to be abrasive and combative, yet allowing he deserved as good as he got on those same active terms, this man should feel the shame descending on him for threatening, quote, a total war if the review I wrote defied his ban and saw the light of day. A sure posterity will add to all he had to say, denouncing naked power, that note, and that will influence its vote. Destroy it I will not, sans evidence agreeable to me, that the consistent sense delivered to his minions concerning me as a nugatory power has ceased to be dinned in their ears. He must reverse, as cleverly he can, this unjust curse. 2, completely different person. Consider for a moment grounds of judgment. Even when he insulted that waitress at the rustic cafe, "I've been in Paris," and then sent emphatically, and he can be emphatic, coffee that was less than perfect back. I bent ever backwards to be his friend, though democratic, coming from his lips, mostly meant elitist. But when he bullied, called him sick, cudgeled verbally and in print, a student eager for his opinion of Bob Dylan, quote, "unfit to lick custard from the boots of any poet I present," unquote. Even I could bear no more. America, this hick cat, wields the power he does that all your people lent. Evince poetic justice. Elect him president. Bob Perelman.
This has been really a pleasure to hear, and I have many thoughts about what's been said tonight. I was thinking what George was saying about David as a language writer, and Ron echoing it in a different way, that my poetry is the best book by a language writer. And it just strikes me how what a sort of interested and contestatory relationship David had with language writing. I mean, he was already, quite a well-established, productive poet. I mean, his early work, he was kind of, to be crude about it, a kind of, a next Creeley in his early precision, tenderness, heterosexuality, lyricism, all of that. And meeting, some of us who got lumped in with this category, he had such an appetite for what Rachel was talking about, self-difference. I mean, he really did. A word for David was always an opportunity to say something different. And as Ron said, he wanted each one of his books to be different. One of his selected poems that came out, he said he was going to make a change in every single poem, etc. And I think that shows up in the syntax of his work in various different ways. But at the same time, he's like he never, he never that old quote, "You never outgrow your need for milk." Well, he never outgrew his need for self, and he was always very much himself. He was a kind of a British music hall comedian. Routines were very amusing to him, and they would always kind of just come in a little bit, and sometimes he would ride them a long way. I don't think we're going to read any of them tonight, but the poem, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, longish, I mean, by poetry standards, 2 and 3 and 4 page stories, are really very funny. And they if things had been different, he could have been in the Monty Python troupe, I think, and done quite, yeoman service there. Anyway, okay, I'm going to read 2 things. One is, I suppose I have to read this. It's for Bob Perelman. It's from the Harbor Master of Hong Kong. And then I'm going to read, it's on page 423. And then I'm going to read the end of the piece, My Poetry, from the book, My Poetry. And by the way, well, I'll wait till I get to my poem. So anyway, this is for Bob Perelman, short poem. The assumptions are islands in the sun, S-O-N. The assumptions are islands in the sun, glancing up from the white Pacific, terribly uninhabitable, where everybody goes who is anybody, to rusticate and masticate and resuscitate the dead art of rhyme as the palms flutter in whose shade touts for the status quo watch the tourists come and go. I too dislike them and their fiddles and their way of being there in the grimy traffic-ridden concourse whenever they close my eyes. Okay, and then this is near the end of the piece, my poetry. It's on page 176. And I remember my poetry is also dedicated to me, and I was always wonderfully surprised and nonplussed by it because it really is a very weird poem. It's written, to some extent, he talks about it at the end of the book, that he took sentences from all the reviews he'd gotten and collaged them in and played with them, etc. And he also stuck in his own poems and commented. But you just really never know what side his irony is buttered on in this poem. I mean, it doesn't resolve at all. Anyway, so I'll just start, and it mixes poems and prose. Psychoanalysis. Often people fuck merely in order to keep from having to talk, but I don't remember everything else I said. I have a strong imagination which sometimes interferes with the poem and becomes distracting. Suddenly, quote, the sight of this creature turned them, the two friends, twin children of adversity, and they fell to arguing, unquote. It's the trouble with all museums. If it sounds like I'm too loose and sloppy, that is not the case. Example, this burg isn't big enough for both of us. I just pulled the strings. I'm not the craftsman George Ellenbogen is, and in some of the poems I appear to display no craftsmanship whatsoever. Nevertheless, at the personal level, I'm one of the most appallingly human of the West Coast poets, perfectly willing to reconcile myself to whatever comes along on a given day, hence enjoy this moment, that moment, no questions asked, no answers needed. No theory today escapes the marketplace. All are put up for choice, all are swallowed. The writer is the widow of an insight, slandering Croatia with a false esteem. It was the last class meeting of Eros and civilization, and we were eating brownies. What can look at itself is not one. Many Europeans and Orientals speak English far more vividly than those of us for whom it is mother tongue. So one evening, being driven on a winding road by our friend Stella and narrowly escaping being struck by an oncoming truck, I screamed. She reprimanded me. An intense, awkward silence ensued, relieved only when 3 sentences appeared before me, a prompt sheet passing across the windshield. The truck had nearly struck their car. He had screamed. She had asked him not to. I spoke them aloud, and the mood in the car turned on a dime. It could also read one's poetry. For my poetry is informed by something inside that doesn't flinch and won't budge. Because a cold rage seizes one at whiles to show the bitter old and wrinkled truth, stripped naked of all vesture that beguiles, because it gives some sense of power and passion in helpless impotence to try to fashion our woe in living words, howe'er uncouth. I like the way these poems scan. They are tight, rhythmical, colloquial, oblique lyrics. I find it exciting the way the terse English accent breaks through at times, asserting facts. The horned moon to rise by night, amid her spangled sisters bright. For his mercies I endure, ever faithful, ever sure. And more facts. The water o'er the pebbles scarce could run, and broad old cesspools glittered in the sun. And I talk in the introduction, David loved that couplet. It's the end of a John Clare sonnet. And he said, well, he had come to 13 lines and he didn't have anything more to write. And that's where but he had needed 14 lines. And that's where the broad old cesspools come in, so that it's a perfect refutation of form is never more than form is never more than an extension of content. Extension of content. Yeah. Anyway, and broad old cesspools. I mean, that's John Clare would know that they would be broad and they would be shining in the English sun. And anyway, back to the poem. The water o'er the pebbles scarce could run, and broad old cesspools glittered in the sun. This is just to say I've gained the art and language in which I bring my readers deeper than any consideration of a personality to the awareness of a living man. Hence, in reading these recent books of mine, one may find oneself in a solitude and a tight corner. That's the name of one of David's books, as I might call it. Edge or risk of being that seems, even as it is most mine, to be speaking for a depth of one's own inner being. Climb, being, sort of, is substitute destiny. Extremely useful and succinct on the problem of writing versus literature. Silence amounts to the same thing. Recommended for university and large college libraries. Sign on librarian's desk. Revenge. I could never have done it alone. The self to write about the products of the self, which the self tries to make as selfless as possible in order that they may be seen to come from the true self by involving it with and invoking it for contiguous other selves, readers. The consistently shifting perspectives of the sentences. Ever a lower limit speech and an upper limit song leads instanter to song. You make me dizzy, Miss Lizzie. And to a speech where soon enough we get pygmy, tangled, spittle, spread, baubles, bangles, broads, and rich or poor. One does not inherit an audience, one builds one, a reader at a time. I join these words for 4 people, some others may overhear them. This air of seeming indifference toward the reader often succeeds. Join now.
Can we put our hands together for all the readers? And Bob is already standing, but I wonder if Ron and Jack would stand so we can thank them for this extraordinary work that they've done. So, with apologies to people who are sitting in that room, whom I'm going to ask to, as best you can, fold up chairs, because we're all heading into that room for some very good food and drink. Please stay anywhere except in that room as long as you like. And the tent outside is a little cooler out there, and we've got that set up so you can hang out there too. Let's thank everybody for this wonderful event one more time.